Hi there. I was in Austin this past week on a work trip, and one of my coworkers asked if I could do a video on buying a first property. And so that's the topic of today's video. Now, I actually have a story to tell from this weekend that illustrates the pros and cons perfectly of owning and managing a property. You can see behind me that I've installed some black curtains. I received some feedback that my previous background was a little weird, so here we go. We've got some nice black curtains. And I installed these because I own the house and I don't have to ask anybody for permission. That's one of the best benefits of owning is you have full control over your living abode. And that, for a lot of people, is really important. On the flip side, you see here on the desk, about an hour ago, I had somebody complain that the sink downstairs was draining really slowly. So I had to undo the P-trap, and I saw there's a bunch of sort of hair and stuff clogged in there, so I shoved it down with a screwdriver into the bucket and cleared the clog. Took me about 10 minutes or so and saved myself a couple $100 without having to hire a plumber. And so, great example. With the flexibility of owning a property also comes the responsibility. And that's the pros and cons. So one of the key things I think you need to realize when you make a house purchase is that the pros outweigh the cons for you. Do you want that flexibility? Do you want that control? And are you willing to deal with all the headaches that come with home ownership at the same time? And unfortunately, that's not an easy decision to flip back and forth on because transacting on a house or any sort of property is a really big transaction. And it's actually quite expensive beyond the emotional impact. I've listed here some of the typical transaction fees involved with both buying and selling a house. On the buying side, you're usually paying something on the order of maybe 3 to 4% closing costs for things like appraisals and title insurance and all sorts of random fees, loan origination fee, et cetera, et cetera. And on the selling side, you're probably paying even more, something more like 8%, because you're covering the commission, the real estate commission for both you, the seller, your agent, as well as the agent representing the buyer, as well as probably some local excise taxes that are on the order of 1 to 3%. So transacting a house or any sort of property is very expensive, and you basically don't want to be doing it frequently. Otherwise, it's really not a good financial move to buy a house. You should just rent. That's one key point is, know and assess the pros and cons and make sure that you're willing to be in it for a long enough period of time. Now, that doesn't mean you have to live there for a long period of time. You could say, hey, I'll live there for a couple of years and then turn it into a rental. And that can be actually a very wise business move financially, which I'll talk about in future videos. So then you're now at this point where you're thinking, okay, I want to buy a house or property. How do I decide what type of property to purchase? Well, I like to break it down into what I call the 3 L's in prioritized order. The first one I consider is location. And by location, I'm not talking about, should I choose this neighborhood or that neighborhood? I'm talking about location on a macro scale. Are you buying a property in a metro area that is going to be growing? Because you're basically putting a huge amount of money down in a leveraged position. And you saw from the 2008 financial crisis that when you're highly leveraged and the market goes down, you can be really, really exposed. So, key question here is where are you located in terms of that house purchase? I happen to be lucky in that I graduated from the University of Washington, which is in Seattle, and Seattle happened to be a big growth city, as we saw. But you maybe are in a Midwest city that is more on the decline, and you should be very careful about purchasing a property where there isn't a lot of future appreciation value. You could be going underwater in a big way. The second factor to really look at is what I call land. And if you think about a property, it's really broken up into 2 pieces. And you can see this when you look at your county assessment reports. There's the value of the land itself, and then there's the value of the actual physical structure that you live in, the building. And in general, land is the commodity that you can't create any more of. And that's the thing that is going to appreciate the most. The actual building structure will actually depreciate. And this is actually factored in. If you ever become a landlord, you actually can factor depreciation as a way to offset your costs if you turn your property into a rental. And so one of my key pieces of advice is to make sure, to the extent you can, try to purchase as much land as you can, because that is going to have the strongest upward price growth potential. Secondary to the land thing, I would say also is to make sure that if you can, try to stick with single family units. And I realize that's hard to do. It's very expensive these days. But if you get into something like a condo is just not going to appreciate as much because you're basically buying the building, that box you're living in, and you're only buying a fractional piece of land. So you can see why the appreciation equation isn't going to be as strong as, say, a piece of land. But secondly, because you're sharing the land, you're also sharing in all the decisions of what happens on that land when it comes to things like repairs and improvements and which vendors to choose when doing XYZ. And you really lose a lot of control when you're buying a property that's on a shared piece of land. So I really would steer you away from that if you can. The third element here is livability. And this is what we typically get emotionally attached to when we go tour a house. What's the kitchen look like? How about the bathrooms? Oh, is it a cute house? And one of my key messages to you is, if you can, I actually think this is the least important one. Mainly because this is the one you can change. If you don't like the kitchen, you can always remodel it. If you don't like the color of the walls, you can repaint it or install a new curtain. But you can't change the location of the house, nor can you change how much land is on there or whether that land is shared. So if you have to compromise on something, think long term and prioritize 1 and 2. And you can always defer and improve 3 if you want to. So those are the 3 L's that I factor when I think about purchasing a property. Now, the last piece of advice I'd give you is that when you buy a property, you really are changing the behavior of your mentality in terms of you as a homeowner versus as a renter. And I want to talk through how I look at that, and maybe that's going to impact you as well. Now, if you're about to be a first-time home buyer, you're probably in this scenario here, where you're a renter and you renting from a landlord. It's a pretty straightforward transaction. You give a monthly amount of rent and you get use of a unit as exchange. Pretty straightforward. When you buy a house, one of my best pieces of advice is to almost separate yourself from the physical embodiment of you who's going to live there as a renter and the abstract embodiment of you who's now a homeowner and, in fact, actually a landlord that is renting to the physical embodiment of you. Now, that sounds complicated, but here's a pictorial description. When you purchase a house, you're now taking on all this extra responsibility. Paying the mortgage, dealing with maintenance issues, dealing with leaky roof or replacing the roof. All those sorts of things are now your responsibility. And in benefit, you're also building equity because you now own this property. But you living there, you're actually indirectly paying rent to yourself as the homeowner, as the landlord, because the house that you've purchased has a fair market rental value. So for instance, if you went from a single 1-bedroom apartment and are now living in a 3-bedroom house, you're effectively paying the market value of rent that you could otherwise charge for that 3-bedroom house. And one of the smartest things you can do is recognize that that doesn't have to be a 1-for-1 relationship. I'll give you an example. A couple roommates upstairs moved out this summer. One bought a house, and because they got along, the other actually went to rent a room in that new house. And so that new owner was really smart in recognizing that she could lower her monthly housing expense, potentially diverting some of that into the stock market, for instance, and getting some of that appreciation, even though she's responsible for the full mortgage payment. So a really smart move is to really make sure you separate the ownership elements and the management elements from you as a resider in that property. Well, hopefully this was a good, initial thought video on buying a house. The last thing I want to kind of leave you with is to remember that this is a long-term commitment, and it's not unlike buying a stock on margin that you're going to hold for 1 or 2 decades. And so unlike stocks where it's very easy to diversify and get in and out, buying a property is a big commitment. It's a big decision. You're probably leveraging yourself, and you're basically putting a lot of decision in one piece of property. And so you want to be very, very considerate and careful in choosing which property you purchase. I'd certainly be happy to help you out a little bit. If you want to discuss more, you have a property in mind, feel free to email me or comment. I can be found at ropeguy@theropeguy.com. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.